In an effort to one day have a miniature for every creature in the D&D Monster Manual, I'm printing, assembling, and painting them all, one mini at a time. So why don't we go ahead and see what's up first today. The Cloaker. This is one of those D&D creatures that I feel doesn't often come across everyone's radar, but as soon as you do encounter one, you're likely to find them almost as iconic as some of the other more well-known D&D monsters. Tricksy Underdark predators, often mistaken by adventurers for torn cloth or hanging cloaks, that delight in antagonizing or otherwise terrorizing their prey. The updated 2024 art for these creatures definitely seems to lean more into the idea of them being a cave-dwelling predator, but kind of does away with some of their original namesake and designs that used to sell them more on this idea that they were often mistaken for cloaks. So, while I do want a mini that fits this newer depiction of a Cloaker, I do think that I want to find a nice middle ground. Over on my mini factory, there are quite a few models that are accurate to the older artwork of these creatures, but I eventually settled on this sculpt by The Printing Goes Ever On, which still feels like it takes inspiration from those older pieces, but has some of those details, such as the spiky back and facial features of the newer design. Luckily, this model came with some decent looking pre-supported files, so we should just be able to run these through Resin to FDM in Blender and print them up on the A1. Looking at some of these supports, they do branch out quite a lot and are very thin in some places. So I'm actually going to bulk these up with a pretty generous 0.2mm thickness in Resin to FDM, then run through all of the usual steps of repairing the model and exporting our 3MF file with all of those settings dialed in. And if you want a full tutorial on the Resin to FDM process that I'm running through here, you can check out the video up in the card and down in the description. And with the new update of Resin to FDM, all of those support settings will be saved in the 3MF file directly from Blender, so all that we'll have to do is open this file in Orca Slicer and hit Slice. Double checking that our process settings and our supports have all of the right values, we'll go ahead, hit Slice, and send this straight over to the printer. Cloakers, named for their appearance, are often mistaken for hanging cloaks or tattered cloth. These predators of the Underdark are dangerous indeed. Blending into their surroundings until choosing to strike, latching on and smothering their prey in powerful wings, cloakers are frightening foes. While many act alone, using their camouflage or illusory abilities to survive, you best pray you don't stumble upon an enclave of these terrifying aberrations. Cleanup for this model was relatively straightforward and followed my usual process for cleaning up a Resin to FDM print. First, going through and snapping off all of the easy to remove supports just with my fingers where it's possible, and then coming in with some clippers where I need to pull off some of those last remaining pieces. For removing some of that support scarring from the model, I just come in with a hobby knife, a file, and even a lighter where needed to help smooth out some of these support connections, ugly overhangs, or areas of the print that just look less than ideal. For both priming and painting our models today, it has been far too cold for me to rattle can prime models, and the weather has been so bad that having a window open to ventilate the airbrush has not been an option, so we'll just be going with brushwork all the way. Starting with a prime with some Army Painter Matte Air Primer, just in 2 generous coats with a brush over the model. Now, onto some colour. For this model, it would have very much benefited from an airbrush, but we should be able to achieve the same effect with a dry brush. Mixing together some dark navy blue with a little bit of grey to help desaturate it, I'll go ahead and dry brush this over the whole model. And I'm being generally quite generous here, coating 95% of the model, only really leaving that black in the deepest recesses of our print. And following the more vibrant base coat, I'll mix up a cool grey with some of that original colour to start building up some brightness across the mini. Dry brushing this on, very similar, but trying to follow a Zenithal pattern, hitting areas that would catch more light from the top, or parts of the model that I want to pull focus, such as the face or front of the wings. Then we can come in with some brushwork. Diving into a pure cool grey to start adding some detail to our mini. Here I'm just adding some splotchy texture to it, to give it that kind of natural variation that we see in some of the artwork. And with that initial highlight done, we can come in with an even brighter cold grey to really start amping up some of that texture. adding in this dotted, almost splotchy look across the model and edge highlighting some of the key areas that we'll be looking at, such as the front of these wings and areas on the face. For the tan colours on our model, I'm going to be starting with a deep grey. This is a slightly warm grey that will help set the base coat for these parts of the Mini without making them feel fleshy. Applying this pretty generously, but still leaving a little bit of that blue in the recesses to help sort of meld these areas of colour together. With this initial coat of a dark grey done, I can go ahead and start mixing some lighter tan into that grey to create a mid-tone. And here I'll be covering about 80% of the area we covered with the dark grey. Again, just leaving that grey in the shadowed recessed areas and starting to build up brightness across these parts of the model using our mixture. And finally, I can come in with a pure tan colour to start really highlighting these areas. Really focusing on those top-faced areas and parts that would easily catch light to both bump up the brightness and make these parts read as the colour we want them to be. And for the face specifically, I'll even brighten this tan colour up a little bit to hit some of the brow line and lips to really help us focus on that part of the Mini. For the teeth and bone across this model, I'll start with a dark ochre colour to help differentiate it a bit from the skin. Then I'll come in with an even lighter tan than our skin tone to help differentiate these teeth from the tan parts of our model so that they don't look like the same material. And I'll even bump these teeth to a pure white where I need to again help push that contrast between the skin and the bone a little bit further. And for the final touch on the Mini itself, a layer of black across the eyes, followed by subsequent dots of both red and orange, to create a bright, fiery, monstrous eye. For the base, I want to sell this Underdark lighting, which is usually blues and purples. So I'll start by mottling these colours across the base, and even though we won't see a lot of this in the final product, it will help set that tone. Then I'll come in with a dark purple speed paint, almost as a wash over the base, to help darken it down and again intensify some of those colours. Then finally we can come in with a dark grey dry brush to help sell this as stone, just leaving the purples and blues in those recesses. And I'll slowly build up through some dry brushes of lighter greys, just making sure not to push the base brighter than the Mini itself. Then, with some glue and a lick of black around the base rim, this Mini will be ready to hit the table. A winding journey through the caverns of the Underdark leads you to an old ruin, a small site of respite on your travel. Old cloth and fallen stone line these walls, and as you set down your things, the surroundings begin to move. The torn fabric strewn across these ruins unfurls, floating down to greet you, fangs bared and poised to strike. A Cloaker now looms above you. Since you're still watching this video, it likely means you're interested in FDM printing for the tabletop. And if that's the case, consider checking out the Painted for Combat Patreon, where for just a couple of bucks you can get access to an awesome community Discord, all of my printer profiles, and Resin to FDM Advanced. Or at the higher STL tiers, get access to not only an awesome welcome bundle of printable goodies, but also our monthly STL releases of miniature bases, like our release for April, the Shattered Shale. A set of generic ruins where shale tile has been flung into dirty earth, perfect for townsfolk fleeing a ruined town or marines setting foot in a destroyed city. And as always, these bases have been sculpted to print support-free on FDM printers. As always, a huge thank you to everyone supporting the channel over on the Patreon, with a special shout out to our Painted for Display tier members. Right, let's get back to it. For the next model in our lineup today, I'm actually backtracking a little bit here, to a Mini that was meant to be included in our previous episode. the Flumph. I actually made this spin on the wheel in time for our previous video with the Death Tyrant. However, after printing this model, it did not survive cleanup, which led me to believe that even if I'd glued it back together, it probably wouldn't have survived a combat on the table. The model that I chose for our Flumphs is this model by Bite the Bullet, which was already floating around in my My Mini Factory library. And I do really like the sculpt, so we're going to stick with it. But before we try and reprint these models, I'm actually going to bring them into Blender to try and make those tentacles a little more FDM friendly, with a method outlined in this previous video using some of Blender's sculpting tools to inflate the more delicate parts of the Mini. Following that, I went ahead and ran our altered files through Blueprint Studio for some quick and easy resin style supports. Then, of course, just followed the same steps I did with the Cloaker to get this model over to the printer. Bizarre creatures with unknown intent, Flumphs are one of the few Underdark denizens known to help strangers and adventurers alike. Feeding on psychic magics, these creatures can often find themselves nearby to more dangerous beings, but will avoid confrontation, and even seek to help those in peril, usually in their own unique Flumph way. Following the same steps as our Cloaker, these Flumphs are going to be pretty easy to get ready for painting. Although this time I'll make sure to spend some extra care when cleaning up these supports, as not to snap off too many of their legs. Luckily, the Blueprint Studio supports do come away relatively easy. I'll just have to be a little more careful in some of the denser areas of support. Luckily, these supports all came off relatively easy with only one or two minor breaks that were easy enough to glue. Then we could just come in with a little bit of cleanup with our hobby knife to help smooth out some of the areas and remove some of that support scarring, reattaching any of the legs that did happen to break, and these models were ready for some priming. Same as before, I'll use the brush to generously coat these with 2 layers of Army Painter's Matte Air Primer, and then they'll be ready for some colour. For our Flumphs today, I want to do 2 different colours. One a yellow and the other red. 2 colours that are both notoriously difficult to get right. So I'll use a darker ochre colour as the base coat for our yellow, that will hopefully give me an easier time building up highlights of a brighter yellow on top, making sure to extend this yellow down the legs, as only the ends of these tentacles will be a different colour. Then of course, repeating this process on our red Flumph as well. Then the slow process of building up highlights of yellow. And this did take a good 5 or 6 layers to get decent coverage and build that brightness up, but it looks pretty good once we do get there. And as always, we can see that I'm focusing these highlights near the top of the model and areas that would be catching light, and slowly making sure to extend this down the tentacles as well. For the red, it was a little bit easier. My first highlight was actually a dry brush, followed by some brushwork of a brighter red, which again took another good 3 or 4 layers to get full opacity and brightness. But these guys are looking pretty good, so let's move on to our blues. Knowing that wet blending our blue into yellow or red would start looking a little bit nasty, I instead opted to create a hard divide, and then with a bit of water on my brush came in and blended out that transition over top of the fully dry yellow base coat. And even if this transition area is a little smaller than I would like, it does do a good job of making it look like this yellow is transitioning into a vibrant blue, without getting a bunch of muddy greens in the middle. Then I came in with some lighter blues to start building up some of that bioluminescent glow, just adding this to the very ends of the tentacles to help sell the glow effect, before coming in with some highlights of pure white. Then it was on to the final details for both of these minis. A base coat of white across the eye, followed by a nice vibrant blue and then a dot of black. And to make our Flumphs feel a little friendlier, a spot highlight of white went on here as well. Moving on to the base, I followed pretty much the same steps as our Cloaker, considering both of these creatures will be in the Underdark. Using those mottled blues and purples followed by a speed paint, but rather than dry brushing our stone this time, I came in with some brushwork to pick out the individual stones. Then I picked out some of the fungus that was sculpted onto this base in the same style that I did for the Flumph's tentacles, and gave these a little bit of a spot glow. And with a drop of super glue to attach our Flumphs to their flight stands, these minis were also ready to hit the table. Lost and wounded, walking these caves, a faint glow moves towards you from ahead. A floating yellow creature is drawn towards the party. It looks friendly enough, but down here that's not usually the case. With very little choice, you follow it through the tunnels, as it leads you deeper still, until eventually showing you to a quiet cave, a place to rest. And in the corner here, a small glowing trinket that promises to heal some amount of injury. Let it be said, you can always trust a Flumph. We're now 2 denizens of the Underdark down, and it seems that the wheel has chosen a theme for today's video, because our third and final creature for the day is the Darkmantle. Another creature that I had no idea existed before spinning it on the wheel. But doing a bit of digging, I found that these are actually quite an interesting monster. Another Underdark dwelling creature that, similar to a roper or a piercer, disguise themselves as a stalactite, and perhaps unsurprisingly, often dwells with those other creatures. Though Darkmantles are not quite like the other creatures, they're far smaller monsters that can best be described as a rocky, flying squid. So much so that they actually rely on an ability to create darkness, opening an opportunity for them to crush and suffocate prey. There's only a few real options for minis for a Darkmantle, so I opted for this model by Printed Encounter, that looked like it would print up nice and easy. Once more with this model, I ran it through the same process as our previous entries to prep it for printing. And given that these are smaller, lower challenge rating creatures that would likely be fighting alongside stronger allies, I decided to print a few of these models, to use more as minions in possible combats. These Darkmantles printed up great, and the supports were super easy to remove. I just had to make sure not to snap off the more delicate parts of the models. And cleanup was pretty much the same as the other models, using a file to flatten out the bottom of these flight stands, and coming in with a knife to nick off any support scarring before gluing these models to the flight stands for painting. Once again, priming with a couple of layers of black primer before moving on to what will be a relatively simple paint job on these minis. To start, I mixed together a grey and dark brown to create this rocky flesh tone that I dry brushed across the mini, leaving quite a bit of black on this model. Then came in with some subsequent highlight layers, mixing in more and more brighter flesh tones to this mixture, building all the way up to an almost buffed hide highlight. Following our initial dry brushing, I came in with a slightly darker tan flesh tone to pick out some of the webbing between the stony elements of this creature. Then I came in with some spot highlights of buffed hide to really try and help these parts of the model stand out against the rest of the rocky skin. And to help add some more variation to this model, I followed the same highlighting process on some of the more protruding parts of the mini. At this stage, I felt that some of these skin tone areas were a little bit bright against the rest of the model, so I came in with a thinned down brown speed paint just to help darken them down and pull some of that detail back out from the print. Then, for the final touch on these minis, I went around the whole model, picking out each of their eyes with a vibrant red. Then I went ahead and glued these models down to some bases that I'd already painted up to match the style of those that we used on our Flumph, making all of these creatures feel like they're in a relatively similar environment, and all ready to hit the table. Rested and recovered, you push forward, the caves dimly lit as you continue your trek, but you do not get far before yet another threat presents itself. The cave begins to move, the spiked rocks on the floor and ceiling burst to life, but it is not the large creatures you need worry about. A swath of Darkmantles fly towards you, each surrounding you in inky darkness. And only then, as your vision is snuffed, do you feel a crushing strength bear down on you. It was actually quite fun today putting together this micro collection of models that all share a similar environment. Not bad spins from the wheel at all. I actually asked in the last episode of this Monster Manual Minis series what you wanted to see. Whether you wanted single focused projects or multiple minis in a single video, and the response seemed rather unanimous. Single focused projects for the more iconic D&D creatures or larger projects, and then sprinkling in some videos more like this one, where we cover multiple other minis that you would use to flesh out an adventure. And it feels like a pretty nice balance. Do be sure to like if you liked, subscribe down below for more FDM printing and tabletop projects, but most importantly, thank you so much for watching. And as always, have a good one.